There are certain 911 calls that never fade from the memory of dispatchers, calls that begin like countless others with panic, confusion, and fragments of information, yet carry something beneath the surface, something off, something that doesn't sit right. The morning of April 12th in Ridgeview, Colorado, was one of those moments. It was a little after 9:40 a.m. when the emergency line lit up. The dispatcher answered the same way she did hundreds of times a week. But the voice on the other end, shaking, breathless, stumbling over every word, belonged to a man who sounded like he was falling apart. My wife, she shot herself. I think she, please hurry, there's blood. She's not responding. I don't know what happened. His name was Ethan Blake, 37 years old, unemployed, a local resident of Hawthorne Trail, a quiet suburban street lined with trimmed lawns, garden gnomes, and the sense of calm people moved to small towns to find. The dispatcher tried to keep him focused, but Ethan spiraled, his breathing shallow and erratic, his words spilling out in half-coherent bursts. He said he'd just stepped out of the shower when he heard two loud bangs, said he ran to the bedroom, said his wife, Charlotte Reed, was lying on the floor, bleeding, said she had accidentally shot herself. One word repeated over and over again, accidental. But the dispatcher, trained to hear what callers don't say, noticed the gaps. He wasn't describing what he saw. He wasn't attempting pressure on the wound. He wasn't giving clear answers. Instead, he kept insisting he couldn't touch her, that the floor was slippery, that he was still wet from the shower. Yet even through the phone, she could hear something else, the subtle tremor of someone who was either truly terrified or trying very, very hard to sound like they were. When the first patrol officers arrived at the scene, the neighborhood was still and quiet. A dog barked somewhere down the street, but otherwise, Hawthorne Trail sat under the Colorado sun untouched, unaware, unprepared for what had unfolded inside the Blake home. The front door was open. Ethan was on the porch, hunched over, elbows braced on his knees, hands shaking. He looked up only when one of the officers called his name. His face was pale, but something about his stillness, his posture, his dry hair sticking neatly in place, stood out. With people experiencing acute shock, bodies often betray them. Trembling, pacing, frantic hand movements. Ethan was different. Controlled, oddly composed except for the tears he pushed out when officers made eye contact. Inside the home, the silence was heavy. The kind of silence that integrates itself with the wallpaper and carpet fibers. The kind that doesn't belong in a house where a 6-year-old boy lives. That's when officers found him, Aiden, Charlotte's son, standing at the end of the hallway in Spider-Man pajamas, his small hands rubbing his eyes. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just stared at the floor as if he already understood something irreversible had happened. He was immediately taken outside and placed gently in the back of a patrol vehicle while paramedics rushed past him. Inside the primary bedroom, the crime scene unfolded with quiet brutality. Charlotte lay on her back, her hair spread out over the hardwood like a fan of dark curls. Her skin was pale, her shirt soaked through in the chest. Nearby were 2 handguns, both 9mm, placed on the floor in a way that seemed arranged. One officer later wrote in his report that the guns looked almost mirrored, as if someone had placed them down with intention. Not dropped, not kicked aside in panic. Placed. But the detail no one could make sense of immediately was this. Charlotte had 2 gunshot wounds, and not the kind one could simply chalk up to an accident. People who want to harm themselves rarely manage to fire twice. People who accidentally discharge a weapon rarely even fire once into themselves, let alone 2 times in the chest. It didn't add up. But the team continued to work, treating it as a medical emergency first, potential crime scene second. The paramedics' movements were swift, steady, by the book. Their voices low, their hands steady, until one of them spoke softly to the lead officer. "She's gone." Outside, Ethan's crying intensified the moment he was told. Or maybe it didn't intensify. Maybe it simply became louder. Grief is a complicated, unpredictable thing. But so is guilt. And officers aren't immune to wondering which one they're looking at. He collapsed back into the porch chair, covering his face with both hands. "She was everything to me. I can't live without her. Why would this happen?" But as the minutes passed, something else became more noticeable. Ethan's repeated insistence on the same details, nearly the same sentences, almost rehearsed. "I had just stepped out of the shower. I heard 2 bangs. She must have shot herself by accident." Over and over, identical wording. Officers are trained to catch patterns. Patterns often tell more than people realize. As the house was slowly secured, one officer noticed something that would become critically important later: a series of small black lenses fixed high in the corners of several rooms. Security cameras, not just 1 or 2, 6 visible in common areas, another outside the front door, and likely more in places they hadn't checked yet. When Ethan was asked about them, his answer was quick, almost too quick. "They don't work. Batteries died months ago. I've been meaning to fix them." But again, there was that pattern, that practiced tone, and then the detail no officer missed. Through the entirety of his grief, Ethan never seemed to take his hand off his phone for long. Messages flicking by, screen on and off, thumb tapping and swiping. Most grieving spouses hold their heads, or clasp their hands, or stare at nothing. Ethan was tapping, erasing, texting someone, deleting camera feeds. The officers didn't know yet, but suspicion quietly settled in the air even before Charlotte's body left the bedroom. Something wasn't right. Something was hidden. Something, if they were lucky, was recorded. By the time investigators from the Ridgeview County Sheriff's Office arrived, the home was sealed, the boy taken to a neighbor's house for temporary care, and Ethan transported to the station for voluntary questioning. Outside, the sun was higher, the street strangely calm, as if the neighborhood itself was holding its breath. No one could have guessed at that moment that the truth behind Ethan's phone calls, his dry hair, his explanations, and the cameras mounted silently above the living room doorway would eventually unravel one of the most disturbing domestic homicide cases Ridgeview had ever seen. And that the first clue had already been found, not in the bedroom, not near the guns, but in the frightened eyes of a child who had heard more than he understood, and in the cameras a man swore had no power. When investigators stepped through the doorway of the Blake residence, the inside of the home felt strangely suspended, as if time had stopped the moment the 2 shots echoed through the walls. The living room was tidy, almost overly tidy, with throw pillows aligned perfectly, shoes placed neatly beside a woven entry rug, and a row of children's books stacked with deliberate care on a small shelf. It was the kind of order that often suggests one of 2 things: a well-kept family or someone who feels safer when everything is exactly where they control it. The officers moved slowly, observing without touching, cataloging the silence. The air carried that unmistakable scent of a house where something terrible had just happened. Not blood, not smoke, but a heavy stillness, a sharp contrast to the suburban calm just beyond the windows. Detective Marissa Cole, the most seasoned investigator in Ridgeview County, arrived a few minutes later. She was briefed quickly by the first responders. The call from 911, 2 gunshots, the husband claiming an accidental self-inflicted wound, the child present but unharmed. And then the detail that already bothered everyone, Ethan's story didn't align with what the officers had seen. She nodded, absorbing the facts with her usual stoic calm. Cole wasn't the type to jump to conclusions. She'd learned long ago that the most dangerous mistakes in homicide work happen when you believe the first version of events, or the second, or even the third. She moved with quiet purpose toward the hallway leading to the bedroom. "Let's start there," she said, her voice low and even. We work backward. The master bedroom looked like a moment frozen. Charlotte's body had already been removed by paramedics, but her presence lingered in every detail. A shirt discarded near the nightstand, a spilled cup of water by the bed, a faint imprint on the mattress where she must have been sitting earlier that morning. Marissa crouched near the place where Charlotte had fallen. There was no broken lamp, no overturned table, no signs of a struggle. And the hardwood floor, which Ethan insisted was slippery from his wet feet, was dry. Not a hint of moisture, not even the faint streaks you'd expect if someone had rushed from a bathroom in a panic. She glanced toward the adjoining bathroom, still dry. "No shower?" she murmured. One of the uniformed officers shook his head. "If he showered, we missed it. Towels aren't wet. Steam on the mirrors? None." Marissa didn't react outwardly, but the note found a place in her mental file. Small inconsistencies often grow into larger truths. She moved to the 2 guns lying neatly on the floor. Their positioning seemed deliberate. 2 parallel lines, barrels facing opposite directions, as if someone had placed them down instead of dropping them. She leaned closer, careful not to disturb anything. Either she was extremely neat in the milliseconds after shooting herself twice, she said quietly, or someone else arranged these. The forensics tech behind her nodded silently. They were thinking the same thing. In the living room, another set of officers were inspecting the layout of the home. It was during this sweep that one of them stopped abruptly beneath a small circular dome fixed high on the wall near the ceiling. "Camera," he said. Detective Cole joined them. The camera was positioned to capture the entire living area and part of the hallway. It wasn't unusual for a home to have 1 or 2 security cameras, especially in a modern suburban neighborhood where package thefts were becoming more common. But this wasn't a doorbell cam or a simple outdoor device. This was indoor surveillance, and as the officers continued the sweep, they found more. One in the kitchen, hidden above the cabinets, another facing the hallway, another near the garage door, and a 4th tucked discreetly under the staircase railing. For a moment, the house felt less like a family home and more like a monitored environment, the kind used by people who either wanted to protect something or watch someone. When asked earlier, Ethan insisted all cameras were dead, drained of battery, and offline. He even claimed he didn't remember how to access recordings anymore. But here was the thing seasoned investigators know. People don't install surveillance cameras and then forget about them, especially not 4 or more. Marissa studied the placement of each device, every angle, every field of view. Together, they'd create almost a complete map of daily life inside the Blake household. "That's a lot of cameras for a home with one child and no security threats," she said softly. "Maybe he liked to feel safe," an officer suggested, but Marissa's tone shifted. "Or maybe he liked to feel in control." While the inside of the house was being documented, a child advocate finished checking on little Aiden, who sat quietly in the back of a patrol car wrapped in a blanket that looked too large for him. His small hands clutched the edge of the fabric, gaze fixed on the houses across the street as though waiting for his mother to appear through the front door. Kids don't often speak right away after trauma, but their silence can be loud. The advocate approached Detective Cole. "He's calm," she said, "but he's watching everything. He's absorbing." "Did he say anything?" Marissa asked. "Just one thing," softly. "He said, 'Mommy screamed.'" Then he stopped talking. A chill traced down the detective's spine. Screamed. But the husband claimed he heard no scream. And if Charlotte had screamed, it meant she was conscious before the first shot. It meant the shooting was not instantaneous or silent or accidental. It meant something more happened. "Did he say anything else?" Marissa asked. "No. But he looked afraid when I asked if he heard the gunshots, almost like he was scared to say the wrong thing. Or scared of someone," the detective added. "Children don't fabricate traumatic details with that level of consistency. Their minds simply don't work that way." The silence between the two women grew heavy. Back inside, Marissa noticed something else during the walk-through, a pattern that seasoned detectives detect almost subconsciously. In the hallway, the dust on the floor was undisturbed. On the kitchen counter, utensils were arranged at perfect right angles. The laundry room showed neatly folded clothes stacked by size. Control, consistency, perfection. These aren't always signs of a crime, but they often hint at a personality type, someone who needs order to stay calm, someone who becomes volatile when life veers out of their control. And the bedroom told the opposite story. Tumult, sharp emotion, a sudden break in the neatness. That contrast alone was enough to keep Ethan high on the suspect list, even if no one said it out loud just yet. Before leaving the scene, Cole paused by the front porch where Ethan had been sitting earlier. His footprints were visible on the wood, faint but present. Again, dry. No dripping water, no footprints wet from a shower, nothing that matched his story. She looked back inside. The air was still, the shadows unchanged, but the truth was very much alive. Somewhere in this tidy, quiet house, in the empty rooms and hidden corners, lay the answers that would unravel everything. One of those answers, she knew, was hidden in the home's surveillance system. The cameras Ethan claimed were useless. The cameras no one yet knew contained the final hours of the woman whose life had been taken. And Part 3 begins when those cameras finally speak. While investigators continued processing the Blake residence, Ethan Blake was transported, voluntarily, to the Ridgeview County Sheriff's Office for questioning. He wasn't in handcuffs. He wasn't under arrest, at least not yet. But the decision to interview him early wasn't a formality. It was strategic. The first hours after a suspicious death are often the most revealing. People grieving authentically tend to speak in fragments, in circles, their emotions unpredictable. But people attempting to maintain a story tend to do the opposite. They repeat themselves, cling to rehearsed phrases, and treat their version of events like a fragile structure that might collapse if anyone opens a window. From the moment Ethan stepped into the interview room, Detective Marissa Cole could already sense which category he might fall into. The room was small, intentionally plain, a table, 2 chairs, a clock ticking softly on the wall. Ethan sat hunched forward, elbows resting on his thighs, hands clasped so tightly the knuckles whitened. His phone had been taken for evidence, leaving him without the one object he'd been clinging to like a lifeline. Cole entered with a calm, measured pace. No rush, no intimidation. Just the quiet authority of someone who had seen hundreds of men sit exactly where Ethan now sat. She placed a file on the table, closed but present. "Ethan," she began gently, pulling out a chair across from him, "I know today has been a shock. I know you're exhausted. But I want you to take your time and walk me through everything that happened this morning, from the moment you woke up." Ethan swallowed hard. His knee bounced under the table. When he spoke, his voice cracked just enough to feel practiced rather than spontaneous. "Like I told the officers, I woke up around 9. Charlotte was already up. She was making breakfast for Aiden. I went to take a shower. I wasn't in long, maybe 5 minutes. And then I heard 2 bangs, loud ones. I thought something fell." Cole nodded slowly, letting him continue. "When I ran out, she was on the floor. The guns were next to her, both of them. I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I called 911 right away." He rubbed his eyes, though they weren't particularly wet. Cole waited a moment before asking, "You said earlier that the floor was slippery, that you were wet from the shower and didn't want to risk falling onto the guns. Is that right?" "Yes," Ethan said, nodding quickly. Too quickly. The floor was wet. From me running. I didn't want to slip. Cole made a small note in the margin of her pad, but her face remained unreadable. "And the guns," she continued. "You said she must have been messing with them?" "I don't know. She liked cleaning them sometimes. Or maybe she dropped one. Maybe it fired. I don't know. It all happened so fast." But this was one of the first cracks. People who truly don't know what happened don't offer explanation so readily. Ethan seemed desperate to supply an answer. Any answer, as long as it wasn't him. Detective Cole shifted the conversation gently. "Tell me about your relationship with Charlotte. Were things okay between the two of you lately?" Ethan straightened up a little, almost offended. "We were great," he insisted. "She was my world. And Aiden, too. We were a good family, sure. We argued sometimes. Everybody argues. But nothing bad. I never laid a hand on her." Cole studied him carefully. "Did Charlotte seem stressed recently? Scared, not herself?" "No," he said quickly. "She was fine. I mean, maybe tired sometimes. Being a mom is stressful, but nothing serious." Another crack. Neighbors had already mentioned off-camera that Charlotte seemed withdrawn over the past few months, quieter, thinner, more cautious when Ethan was nearby. Cole didn't press it yet. Instead, she leaned forward slightly. "Ethan, earlier today your son, Aiden, told our child specialist that he heard his mom scream before the gunshots. Do you remember hearing any scream?" His jaw tightened. His eyes darted away. "No, he's confused," Ethan said. "He's 6. Kids get things wrong." He he lies sometimes. Cole made another note. Calm, controlled. Does he lie about things like this? She asked softly. I don't know, Ethan snapped. He just makes things up sometimes. It was a defensive answer. Too defensive. Guilt often sounds like anger trying to hide itself. Cole let his words sit for a moment before changing direction. Ethan, when officers arrived, they noticed cameras throughout your home. A lot of them. You told them they didn't work, but they looked in good condition. Why so many cameras? An almost imperceptible freeze. Then Ethan forced a shrug. It's just home security. Everyone has them now. On the inside? Cole asked. In the living room? Over the kitchen doorway? Down the hallway? Ethan's lips tightened. I installed them because Ridgeview had break-ins last year. I'm protecting my family. But they're not connected. Batteries are dead. They haven't worked in months. Another note, another fold in the narrative. Detective Cole didn't challenge him outright. That was rarely effective early on. Instead, she closed her notebook gently, rested her hands on the table, and spoke with a tone that felt almost maternal. Ethan, accidents happen. Stress happens. Marriages have rough patches. People panic. If something different happened this morning, if things got heated, if a mistake was made, this is the time to be honest about it. His breathing quickened. His leg bounced faster. Are you saying I shot her? Ethan burst out, voice rising. Is that what you think? That I would hurt her? I loved her. Cole's voice remained steady. I'm not saying anything. I'm listening. And right now, the pieces of your story don't match the pieces in the house. For a brief second, Ethan's mask slipped. His expression twisted into something frustrated, fearful, and volatile. The kind of expression that reveals more than any confession. He exhaled hard, shaking his head. I need a lawyer, he said finally. I'm not talking any more. Cole nodded once. She didn't need more, not yet. They had the house, they had the child statement, they had the inconsistencies, and soon enough they would have the cameras. As Ethan was escorted to a holding area, Detective Cole stepped out into the hallway, where two forensic technicians were waiting with a sealed plastic box. Inside were 3 hard drives and 2 micro SD cards, all pulled from various camera hubs throughout the Blake home. The good news, one tech said quietly, is that they're intact, no sign of wiping. A couple were partially overwritten, but most of the data looks recoverable. Cole nodded slowly. She didn't smile. She never smiled during cases like this. But she felt that unmistakable shift that happens when an investigation moves from speculation to evidence. Start processing everything, she said. Every angle, every file, every timestamp. She looked back toward the interview room where Ethan had been sitting minutes earlier. He says the cameras don't work, she murmured. But they're about to tell us a very different story. And the truth, buried for weeks inside that house, was finally about to begin unraveling. If there is one thing detectives learn early, it's that houses have memories, not just through the people who live in them or the objects left behind, but through the devices we install, often without thinking twice. For the Blake residents, those memories were stored in a network of small, nearly invisible cameras tucked into corners and mounted under the eaves. Cameras Ethan Blake insisted were dead, offline, no batteries, not working for months. By the evening of April 12th, Every one of those devices had been removed, tagged, and transported to the digital forensics lab, and now, in a dimly lit evidence room, a team of specialists gathered around the first recovered hard drive. Detective Marissa Cole stood at the back of the room, arms crossed, her expression steady. She wasn't expecting miracles. Many home systems overwrite footage automatically. Some corrupt during power cuts. Others stop recording without notice. And sometimes, when suspects realize cameras hold their secrets, they destroy the system completely. But this case was already unusual. When the technician connected the drive and the first file tree loaded on screen, the room fell silent. Not only did the cameras work, not only had they been recording, but they had been recording recently, including the days and hours before Charlotte's death. It was, in every sense, the break the investigation needed. The first clip they opened was time-stamped April 10th, 2 days before the shooting. The view came from a camera positioned high in the living room corner, angled to capture both the couch and part of the hallway. The footage was simple. Ordinary afternoon light filtering in, toys scattered near the coffee table, a kid's backpack half unzipped on the floor. Then Charlotte appeared. She walked into frame wearing sweatpants and a loose t-shirt, her hair tied up, moving quietly through the living room with a kind of gentle routine. She picked up Aiden's toys, folded a stray blanket, placed a book back on the shelf. Her movements were calm, soft, almost too soft. Marissa watched closely. People reveal themselves when they think no one is watching. There was something in Charlotte's posture, a slight slump, tension in her shoulders, the way she paused before sitting on the couch. That hinted at more. Weariness, a lingering anxiety. The moment Ethan entered the frame, that weariness sharpened. He walked into the living room quickly, almost abruptly, holding a coffee mug in one hand and his phone in the other. He didn't look at Charlotte. He didn't say anything. Instead, he moved straight toward the kitchen, his jaw tight. Charlotte glanced at him for half a second, just a flicker, then looked down, folding the blanket again, even though it was already folded. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, but it said everything. Control doesn't always shout. Sometimes it sits quietly on the couch, waiting for permission to breathe. Another clip loaded next. This one from the hallway camera, time-stamped April 11th, the day before Charlotte died. This footage changed everything. Charlotte and Ethan were in the hallway facing each other. Ethan's posture was tense. His hand gestured sharply. The audio didn't pick up clearly. The system seemed to record video only, but even without sound, their body language told its own story. Charlotte was crying, not dramatic sobbing, just silent tears she wiped away quickly, as if embarrassed. Ethan stepped closer. His movements were big, agitated, his arms slicing through the air in frustration, not striking her, not touching her, but looming, crowding, controlling the space. One of the forensic techs leaned closer to the monitor. "You can tell he's yelling," he murmured. Marissa nodded. She had seen this posture 100 times. In domestic cases where emotional violence preceded physical violence by months, sometimes years, Ethan eventually stormed out of frame, leaving Charlotte standing alone in the hallway, hands covering her face. The clip ended, but the silence in the room deepened. This wasn't enough for an arrest. Not yet, but it painted a picture, one Ethan had been trying hard to hide. Then came the file everyone in the room was waiting for, April 12th, the morning of the incident. The camera feed opened to a view of the hallway outside the master bedroom. The time stamp appeared in the corner, 9:36 a.m. Aiden stepped into view first. The little boy stood in the hallway wearing cartoon pajamas, clutching a blanket. His hair was messy, his eyes tired. He walked toward his mother's voice, faint, muffled, coming from the bedroom. Charlotte appeared a moment later. She knelt and wrapped her arms around him. The feed had no sound, but her lips formed the words every mother says instinctively, "I love you?" She kissed his forehead, smoothed his hair, held him a little longer than necessary, almost as if she knew something was changing or breaking or about to end. This moment, innocent, ordinary, heartbreaking, would later become a centerpiece of the case. Aiden left the frame first, walking back toward the living room. Charlotte watched him go, then turned and disappeared into the bedroom. 30 seconds of empty hallway followed. Then Ethan entered. He walked quickly, his hair perfectly dry, fully dressed in jeans and a hoodie. He wasn't dripping water. There was no towel in his hand, no rush of someone responding to a crisis. He didn't go into the bedroom immediately. Instead, he moved toward the kitchen, out of frame for a moment, then returned holding what appeared to be small plastic bags, stuffing them hurriedly inside a drawer near the hallway. The room of investigators watching the footage exchanged looks, but Marissa's face stayed neutral, focused, absorbing every detail. Ethan then disappeared into the bedroom. Seconds later, the audio from the 911 call, captured separately and synchronized by the technician, was played under the footage. "My wife, she shot herself. Please, please hurry." But the video showed the opposite of panic. Ethan wasn't kneeling by Charlotte. He wasn't applying pressure. He wasn't shouting for help. He was moving around the house, rummaging, organizing, closing drawers. At one point, he stepped into the hallway again, checked over his shoulder, then went into the laundry room and placed something behind the washing machine. One of the technicians paused the footage. "That's deliberate," he said quietly. "He's hiding something?" Marissa exhaled slowly. This wasn't just inconsistent with his 911 call. It was damning. The accident narrative was unraveling piece by piece. And then came the last portion of the clip, the part that made even the experienced technicians shift uncomfortably. At the exact moment Ethan told the dispatcher, "I'm by her side. I'm trying to help her." The video showed him pacing in the hallway, not touching Charlotte at all. The timestamp matched perfectly, every second lined up. He was lying in real time. When the video ended, no one spoke for several moments. The evidence wasn't complete. They still needed ballistics, autopsy results, and formal interviews. But the direction of the investigation had changed permanently. The cameras had spoken. Detective Cole finally broke the silence. "Secure all of this," she said, her voice steady. "Every frame, every timestamp. This is the backbone of our case." She turned away from the monitors, the weight of the truth settling in. "Charlotte didn't shoot herself," she said quietly. "Someone else pulled that trigger. Long before a crime is committed, long before the moment violence erupts, there are patterns, subtle, consistent currents that shape the daily life of a household. These patterns don't show up in police reports, rarely appear in medical files, and often go unnoticed by friends and family. But when investigators look back, especially in cases like the death of Charlotte Reed, those patterns become unmistakable. By the morning of April 13th, Detective Marissa Cole had watched enough of the Blake home surveillance footage to understand that the tragedy didn't begin with gunfire. It began much earlier, weeks or months before the final moment captured on video, and the pattern had one defining characteristic: control. The investigation shifted focus. Rather than seeing Ethan Blake only as the man who discovered his wife's body, detectives began examining him as someone who shaped the environment inside the home, someone who influenced every decision, every movement, every silence. Surveillance footage can be brutal in its honesty. It catches things no one intends to reveal. And in nearly every clip, in the kitchen, the living room, the hallway, Ethan's presence altered the atmosphere of the entire space. In video after video, Charlotte's body language spoke before she ever said a word. She moved quietly, cautiously, her shoulders rounded inward. She avoided crossing paths with Ethan when he paced through the house. She hesitated before speaking. She flinched when he opened drawers abruptly or slammed cabinets shut. These weren't moments of physical violence. They were moments of psychological climate, tiny snapshots shaping a larger truth. Detective Cole, with her years of experience, recognized these signals immediately. "This is a home where someone is walking on eggshells," she said during a briefing. "It's in the posture, the hesitation, the compliance." The digital forensics team continued reviewing the files, building a timeline leading up to the shooting. They noted how the tone between Ethan and Charlotte shifted depending on his mood. April 8th, 4 days before the shooting. A clip showed Charlotte helping Aiden with his homework at the dining table. She smiled gently as she corrected his writing. The moment looked peaceful, until Ethan walked into the frame. Without saying a word, he pointed at the TV remote sitting across the room. Charlotte immediately stood, retrieved it, and handed it to him. Small, subtle, automatic. Not the behavior of an equal partnership. April 9th, 3 days before the shooting, another clip caught Ethan pacing the living room while Charlotte sat on the edge of the couch, nervously twisting a blanket. He spoke with broad gestures, leaning in too close, backing her toward the armrest. No sound was captured, but the meaning was clear. A relationship ruled not by mutual respect, but by fear and appeasement. Detective Cole met with Charlotte's sister, Megan, who arrived from out of town after hearing the news. They sat in a quiet office at the station, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly overhead. Megan's hand shook as she held a tissue. "She stopped calling me as much," she admitted. "I thought she was just busy with Aiden. But now I think she didn't want Ethan to hear her talking to anyone." Cole kept her tone gentle. "Did she ever mention being afraid?" There was a pause, the kind where a person sifts through all the moments they dismissed, all the things they brushed off, all the signs they wish they'd questioned sooner. "She said he didn't like her having friends, or going out, or posting pictures online," Megan recalled. "She said he got jealous easily. She said it was easier to just avoid upsetting him." Control disguised as concern, control disguised as protection, control disguised as love. This wasn't unusual, but it was always dangerous. Back at the forensics lab, another clip loaded, one from April 11th, the night before Charlotte's death. The footage showed the couple in their bedroom. Charlotte sat on the edge of the bed, eyes down. Ethan stood by the dresser, pointing at something on his phone screen aggressively. He paced. He talked quickly. Charlotte nodded repeatedly, like someone trying to survive the storm rather than participate in the conversation. "Pause there," Cole said softly. The tech froze the frame. Ethan's expression was harsh, eyes narrowed, jaw clenched. Charlotte looked small beside him, diminished, controlled. There was no raised hand, no visible threat, but the imbalance of power was unmistakable. To a stranger, the scene might look like an argument. To a trained investigator, it looked like a warning. "This is escalating," Cole said. "He's cornering her emotionally. That's the pattern." Domestic control doesn't always leave bruises. It often leaves traces that only become clear in hindsight. Social isolation, financial dependence, restricted movement, monitoring. And the Blake house had one more piece of evidence: the cameras. Why would someone need that level of surveillance inside their own home? One possibility was security, but another, far more likely, was monitoring behavior. "Who installs cameras inside their own hallway?" one officer asked during briefing. "Someone who wants to know exactly what's happening when they're not in the room," Cole answered. As the timeline of recordings grew, so did the picture of Ethan's behavior. He didn't just watch Charlotte. He anticipated her movements. He questioned her pauses. He demanded explanations for insignificant things. His presence changed her entire way of walking through her own home. This was coercive control, a pattern invisible to the world outside, but painfully visible to investigators now watching it unfold frame by frame. But patterns are not prosecution. They are context. To move forward, Cole needed to know if this pattern connected directly to Charlotte's final moments, and whether it explained Ethan's behavior after the gunshots. That's where the autopsy came in. The medical examiner's initial findings arrived late in the afternoon. One gunshot wound from a rubber round, one fatal shot from a 9mm bullet, distance approximately 3 feet, trajectory downward, entering high on the chest. But there was something else. There were no gunshot residue patterns on Charlotte's hands, no soot, no stippling, no transfer. She did not fire the weapon. In the quiet of the briefing room, that detail hit like a cold realization. "She didn't shoot herself," Cole said, her voice low but certain. "That removes the accident narrative completely." The officers around her nodded. The case was no longer ambiguous. It was no longer a tragic mystery. It was a homicide, one that didn't fit a sudden eruption of violence, but rather one that fit a long, slow pattern of control, tightening like a vice until it finally snapped. By the end of Part 5, the investigative team had a clearer picture than ever. Charlotte lived under control. She feared conflict. She tried to keep peace by minimizing herself. She endured a storm of emotional pressure quietly, day after day. And the morning she died was not an isolated moment. It was the culmination of a pattern that had been building for a long time. The next step was determining exactly how that pattern turned fatal, and why Ethan was so desperate to hide what the cameras had captured. Because soon, the footage of the final hours and the minutes after the gunshots would reveal what truly happened in the Blake home. By the time investigators reached the final batch of recovered surveillance clips, they already knew the broad outlines of what happened inside the Blake home. They understood the dynamics. They understood the fear. They understood that Charlotte Reed had been living inside an emotional pressure cooker that had been tightening for months, maybe longer. But now they needed the last piece, the timeline of April 12th, the day Charlotte died. What exactly happened that morning? What triggered the final confrontation? And why did Ethan Blake lie about nearly every detail of it? To answer those questions, the investigation team gathered once more in the digital forensics lab, the overhead LED lights casting pale reflections across the screens. Detective Marissa Cole stood behind the technicians, arms folded, prepared for the hardest footage yet, not because of violence, but because of clarity. Sometimes the truth isn't loud. Sometimes it's quiet, and that quiet can be devastating. 9:04 a.m., the first movements. The earliest recording from that morning showed a calm scene. Charlotte walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, still wearing her sleep clothes. Her hair was tied back loosely, and she moved with that same soft caution seen in earlier footage, the caution of someone used to adjusting themselves around another person's temper. Aiden was sitting at the dining table with cereal in front of him. Charlotte ruffled his hair and kissed the top of his head. Even without sound, her affection radiated clearly. She poured herself coffee. She checked her phone. She glanced toward the bedroom, but didn't go inside. There was something hesitant in her posture, something uncertain, something that suggested she didn't want to disturb someone who was still sleeping. Except he wasn't? Because a moment later, the bedroom door opened. Ethan stepped out. He wasn't groggy. He wasn't stretching or blinking against the morning light. He walked straight into the hallway with purpose, fully awake and already on edge. The technicians paused. "You see this?" one murmured. "He's alert, like he's been up." Detective Cole nodded slowly. Ethan had told her he was still half asleep when the shots happened. But this footage contradicted that entirely. And that contradiction was only the beginning. 9:11 a.m., the first signs of tension. A second clip captured Charlotte near the kitchen counter, stirring her coffee. Ethan entered the frame, his jaw set, shoulders tense. Without audio, the techs couldn't hear what he said. But his expression made the tone clear. He was irritated. He stepped closer to her. Too close. She kept her gaze downward, nodding slightly, almost apologetically. Her hands trembled faintly as she placed the spoon in the sink. Then Ethan raised his hand and pointed toward her phone on the counter. He spoke quickly, his gestures sharp. Charlotte's posture folded inward, like someone absorbing impact without being touched. One technician whispered, "He's confronting her about something." Detective Cole didn't respond. She kept her eyes fixed on the screen, absorbing the micro-interactions. The subtle flinch, the defensive lean, the way Charlotte's breathing visibly changed. This wasn't spontaneous. This wasn't a bad morning. This was a pattern reaching its peak. 9:19 a.m., the camera in the hallway. The next footage came from the hallway camera, the same one that captured Charlotte's last moments with her son in Part 4. This time, only Ethan appeared. He moved toward the master bedroom, carrying something small in his hand, something he placed on the dresser as soon as he entered. His movements were quick, intentional, almost rehearsed. Then he turned back into the hallway, glancing over his shoulder, as if checking whether Charlotte was near. At that moment, Charlotte stepped into the frame. She said something, or tried to. Her mouth moved slowly, her expression tense but pleading. She reached toward him gently, as if trying to calm him or explain something. Ethan stepped back. His response was definitive, a short, dismissive hand gesture followed by a sharp shake of his head. Charlotte froze. That freeze, that single second of hesitation, said everything. People don't freeze unless they fear the reaction that might follow. 9:24 a.m. Emotional unraveling. Another clip, this one from the living room camera. Charlotte had moved into the room alone. She was standing near the window, her hand on her forehead, her breathing visibly shallow. The sunlight caught her face, revealing the faint sheen of tears she kept wiping away quickly, almost angrily, as if trying not to let them form. She wasn't sobbing. She wasn't dramatic. She was exhausted. Aidan walked into the room and tugged gently on her sleeve. She crouched, hugged him, and pressed her forehead lightly to his. This moment was the emotional hinge of the entire morning, the calm before the irreversible break. Charlotte held her son too long, too tightly, as if she instinctively sensed that their morning together was slipping into danger. Detective Cole stared at the paused frame a little longer than expected. Even without sound, even without context, anyone could feel the weight of that embrace. 9:29 a.m. The bedroom door closes. The next clip was short, but crucial. Charlotte entered the bedroom. She paused as if trying to gather courage before walking fully inside. Then she disappeared from view. A moment later, Ethan approached the same door. He paused too, but for a different reason. His pause felt strategic. His hand clenched briefly at his side. His jaw tightened. Then he stepped inside and closed the door behind him. The view from the hallway camera ended there, but the timeline continued. 9:31, 9:36 a.m. The missing footage. There was a gap. A 6-minute period with no footage. At first, the team feared the files were corrupted. Sabotage, deletion, data overwrite. But after closer examination, the technicians realized the hallway camera hadn't stopped recording. The bedroom door simply blocked its view. Inside that room, behind that closed door, the final confrontation unfolded. No cameras, no witnesses, no audio. But based on the 2 gunshots recorded at approximately 9:36 a.m., investigators began to reconstruct the sequence. Charlotte's scream, heard by Aidan. 2 shots, seconds apart. No sign of struggle in the footage from moments earlier. No sign Charlotte ever held a firearm that morning. It was the final missing piece of a puzzle that was already taking shape. 9:36 a.m. The aftermath. The next footage showed Ethan rushing out of the bedroom, not to help Charlotte, not to call 911 immediately, but to move through the house quickly, urgently. He dropped something behind the washing machine. He stuffed items into a hallway drawer. He paced back and forth, wiping his hands on his jeans, checking his phone repeatedly. Only after nearly a minute of prep did he dial 911. When he spoke to the dispatcher, claiming he was wet from the shower and slipping on the floor, the footage showed the opposite. He was dry, he was steady, he was calm enough to hide things. Detective Cole had seen enough. The room fell into the same heavy silence that followed the earlier clips, only now that silence carried certainty. Charlotte didn't walk into a fatal accident. She walked into a final confrontation with a man she feared, a man who had been losing control over her and tightening his grip more each day. The timeline was complete, and the case was ready to shift from investigation to prosecution. In most homicide cases, the investigation eventually reaches a turning point, a moment where the separate threads of evidence begin weaving into a single, undeniable narrative. For Detective Marissa Cole and the Ridgeview investigative team, That moment arrived in the days following the discovery of the final surveillance clips. What they had now was more than suspicion, more than intuition, more than emotional context. They had evidence, tangible, measurable, consistent, and it was piling up against Ethan Blake with increasing weight. But to build a prosecutable case, evidence must be organized, sharpened, connected. And that required turning a wall of observations into a structured, airtight story. The next step in the investigation was not in the forensics lab or the digital suite. It began in a small office where Cole and the lead forensic analyst sat across a table from each other, preparing a timeline. The timeline meeting. The dry erase board in the room was divided into columns: behavioral pattern witness statement, digital evidence, physical evidence, contradictions. It looked more like a strategic briefing than a domestic homicide case. The analyst began reading from his notes. Okay, first category, pre-incident behavioral patterns. Cole nodded, ready. Charlotte displays consistent signs of fear and emotional withdrawal. Surveillance shows avoidance behaviors, tense posture around Ethan, hesitation to speak. Ethan displays agitation, pacing, aggressive gestures, but no physical violence caught on camera. Cole added quietly, but control is a form of violence. It just doesn't leave bruises. This category alone wasn't enough to prosecute, but it established motive, or at least context. Next came witness statements. Neighbors reported hearing arguments in recent weeks, the analyst said. Not yelling, but sharp conversations, as one neighbor put it. Charlotte's sister reported isolation, lost contact, increased anxiety. Cole wrote one word under the category, pattern. The analyst continued. Now, digital evidence, the big one. Cole leaned forward. Surveillance shows Charlotte emotionally distressed the night before the shooting. Ethan awake and alert hours earlier than he claimed. Aiden hearing a scream before the gunshots. Ethan hiding items around the house after the shots. Ethan's clothing dry, contradicting his just-finished showering narrative. Ethan delaying the 911 call. Each point struck like a quiet hammer. Cole circled the word contradictions on the board. The autopsy report. Later that afternoon, the official autopsy report arrived. Though the team already knew many details, the finalized findings strengthened the case significantly. No gunshot residue on Charlotte's hands, no stippling consistent with self-inflicted firing range, angle of entry inconsistent with suicide. First round believed to be a rubber bullet, non-lethal. Second round, fatal, fired from approximately 3 feet away. Cole read through the report slowly, methodically. She'd handled dozens of autopsy results in her career, but this one carried a particular heaviness, not because it was shocking, but because it confirmed what the entire case had been pointing toward. For the first time, she allowed herself to say it plainly. This wasn't a moment of panic. It was an act of escalation. The rubber round told a story, a chilling one. A round meant to injure or intimidate, not kill. A round used in scenarios where someone wanted to inflict fear. The fatal shot came only after. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't spontaneous. This was control turning lethal. Interviewing Aiden. Again, a second interview with Aiden was conducted by a child forensic specialist. This time, they proceeded with extreme care, using drawings, soft questions, and open-ended prompts. "What did you hear that morning?" the specialist asked gently. Aiden looked at the crayons, then at the specialist. "Mommy screamed," he whispered, echoing his earlier statement. He paused. "Then I heard 2 bangs." The specialist nodded softly. "Did you see your mommy?" Aiden shook his head. "No. Daddy told me to stay in my room." "What did Daddy say after the bangs?" Aiden hesitated long enough to show he was thinking, not inventing. "He said Mommy hurt herself." The phrasing struck the specialist immediately. This wasn't a child's language. This was repeated from an adult. Kids don't naturally say hurt herself in that tone. They say she fell, or she got hurt, or something happened. The phrasing was coached. When the interview ended, the specialist met Detective Cole outside the room. "I can't say exactly what happened," she said, "but I can say with confidence, this child is repeating a narrative he was given." Cole wrote the note into her file. Ethan scripted the story. Another nail in the coffin. Physical evidence. The final pieces. The lab technicians returned with another update. The plastic bags Ethan hid behind the washing machine contained narcotic tablets. A small bag of crystalline residue, a burner phone with deleted messages. The drug possession was a separate issue, but the phone was critical. Though the messages had been deleted, the data wasn't entirely gone. It hinted at arguments about jealousy, about distrust, about accusations. "Whatever was going on," the technician said, "it wasn't peaceful." Cole nodded. Then came a discovery even more damning. The fingerprint analysis on the 2 guns revealed Ethan's prints on both weapons, Charlotte's prints on neither. The idea of accidental suicide evaporated instantly. The analyst added one last note. The placement of the guns was staged. Cole already knew this. She saw it the moment she entered the bedroom on day 1. But now she had confirmation, and the evidence wall in the briefing room was complete. The prosecutor meeting. On the afternoon of April 16th, Cole met with the district attorney, a meticulous, sharp man named David Halloway, known for building airtight cases. He reviewed the footage, the autopsy report, the timestamps, the contradictions, the behavioral patterns. He asked only one question. Is there anything at all, that suggests Charlotte held a gun that morning? Cole answered without hesitation. No, not one piece of evidence. Not behavioral, not digital, not physical, nothing. Halloway closed the folder. I'll issue the warrant. Cole exhaled quietly. It was time. The arrest that evening, with officers positioned around the Blake residence, Ethan was taken into custody. He didn't resist. He didn't argue. He didn't shout. He simply stared at Cole as she read him his rights, his expression unreadable, a blend of resignation and disbelief, the look of a man who had constructed an entire narrative in his mind and was now stunned that anyone saw through it. As he was placed in the patrol vehicle, Cole stood on the sidewalk, hands on her hips, watching a neighborhood that looked perfectly peaceful from the outside. A house like any other, a street like any other, a morning like any other. But inside those walls, a story had unfolded, one built on fear, control, and escalating behavior that culminated in tragedy. And now, the legal process would begin. But the investigation was not over, because what came next, the trial preparation, the cross-examinations, the unraveling of Ethan's alternate stories, would reveal even more about the truth behind Charlotte Reed's final day. When detectives arrest a suspect, the clock doesn't stop. It restarts. Every step forward leads to the next layer of truth. and every false statement becomes a thread investigators can trace backward. For Detective Marissa Cole, bringing Ethan Blake into custody wasn't the end of the interrogation phase. It was the beginning of the real one. The first interview, conducted hours after Charlotte's death, was built on assumption. Ethan assumed he could control the narrative. He assumed investigators had nothing concrete. He assumed his performance would suffice. But now, with the evidence stacked against him, the surveillance footage, the autopsy, the timeline, the contradictions, Cole wasn't walking into an interview room hoping for answers. She was walking in with answers. And she wanted to see whether Ethan could survive hearing them. The new interrogation room. The room was the same one Ethan had sat in days earlier, unchanged except for one detail. This time, the walls didn't feel empty. They felt weighted, with evidence, with truth, with the knowledge that his narrative was collapsing. Ethan was seated again, hands cuffed loosely in front of him, posture rigid, jaw working nervously. He still wore the same dark hoodie, but now it looked smaller on him, like he was shrinking inside it. Detective Cole entered with a folder tucked under her arm. She didn't slam it on the table. She didn't raise her voice. She simply sat, opened her notebook, and offered a quiet, steady greeting. "Ethan." He didn't respond. Cole maintained the silence for a beat, letting it settle in the room, letting him feel the weight of her presence. Then she began. "I want to revisit our conversation from the day Charlotte died. We have new information, new evidence, and this is the time for you to tell the truth." Ethan swallowed. "I told you the truth." She shook her head gently. "No, Ethan, you told us a version, not the truth." Contradiction Part 1, the shower. Cole placed a still frame on the table. Ethan looked down reluctantly. It was the hallway camera screenshot showing him fully dressed, a hair-dry alert, walking toward the bedroom at 9:11 a.m. "Does this look like a man who just stepped out of the shower?" she asked softly. Ethan's lip twitched. I dried off." "Completely? In less than 1 minute?" Cole asked. He had no answer. She continued, "You told dispatchers your feet were slipping on the floor from the shower. There were no wet footprints, no water in the bathroom, no steam, no damp towels, nothing." He shifted in his chair. "I don't remember everything clearly." Cole leaned in just slightly, voice soft but unyielding. "You remember enough to lie. That's selective memory, Ethan, not confusion." Contradiction R2, the scream. She placed another screenshot on the table, the forensic interview transcript from Aiden's statement. Aiden said he heard his mother scream. Ethan's eyes flickered defensively. He's a kid. He makes things up. Cole raised an eyebrow. About the morning his mother died. He used the exact phrase, "Mommy screamed." How would he know to say that? Ethan glared at the table. "I don't know." "You told us there was no scream," she pressed gently. "But the scream is the most important detail. Because people who accidentally shoot themselves do not scream before the shot." A shiver passed across Ethan's shoulders, barely visible, but enough. She let the silence close around him again. Contradiction 3. The cameras. Cole slid the next photo forward. Stills of the surveillance cameras hidden throughout the home. "You said they didn't work." "They didn't," Ethan said quickly. "Then how did they record this?" she asked, clicking the remote. The screen behind her lit up with grainy footage of Ethan pacing the house after the gunshots, moving items, hiding bags, checking his phone. He froze, staring at his own image on the screen. Cole continued, "These cameras recorded for weeks. They recorded your arguments, your pacing, Charlotte's fear. They recorded the morning of her death. And then she delivered the blow. They recorded you hiding drugs while you were still on the phone with 911, claiming you were applying pressure to your dying wife." His jaw clenched. His breathing grew shallow. Cole whispered, "If cameras don't work, Ethan, how did they capture all of this?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. Contradiction. 4. The guns. Cole opened the final folder, the fingerprint analysis. "You told us Charlotte handled both guns that morning." Ethan nodded quickly. She cleans them sometimes. Maybe she touched them earlier." Cole's voice remained quiet, steady. There were no prints of hers on either weapon. He blinked rapidly. "Maybe she wiped them. I don't know." Cole cut him off gently. "No, but you touched them, both of them, and you carefully placed them on the floor to stage an accident." She slid the report closer. "You weren't careless, Ethan. You were strategic." He pressed his lips together tightly, a flicker of anger crossing his features before he masked it again. The autopsy revelation. Cole now opened the autopsy summary. The medical examiner found a rubber bullet wound, non-lethal. She waited. Ethan said nothing. And then the fatal shot, fired from 3 feet away, entering at a downward angle. Still no response. "This isn't self-harm," she said plainly. "The physical evidence makes it impossible." Ethan shifted, gripping the edge of the table. "What are you saying?" he asked through clenched teeth. Cole looked directly into his eyes. "I'm saying Charlotte didn't shoot herself. Someone else fired the gun. And you were the only adult in the house." The subtle break. There's a moment in many interrogations when the suspect's internal narrative cracks. Not a confession, not yet, but a shift. A microsecond where their shoulders drop, or their breathing changes, or their eyes drift away from the lie they've clung to. Cole watched for it, and then she saw it. Ethan's hands stopped fidgeting. His knee stopped bouncing. His stare hollowed out for a fraction of a second. The look of a man realizing the walls were closing in. That was the moment. He wasn't ready to confess. Not yet. But the performance was failing. Cole closed the folder gently. "You don't have to tell me what happened today," she said calmly. "But you know what happened. Charlotte knows what happened. And now the evidence knows what happened." Ethan's voice cracked. "You're twisting everything," he said weakly. "No," Cole replied softly. "You twisted everything. We're just straightening it." The final move. Cole stood, signaling the end of the session. "You'll have the opportunity to speak with your attorney," she said. "But understand this. Your story doesn't match the evidence, the timeline, your child's statement, the autopsy, or even your own actions." She gathered her papers. "When the truth doesn't fit the facts, Ethan, it's not the facts that need to change." Ethan looked up with an expression that hovered somewhere between anger and collapse. Do I still get to explain?" he whispered. Cole paused at the door. "Yes," she said quietly. "In court." And with that, the interrogation ended, not with a confession, but with something arguably more powerful, the suspect realizing he has nowhere left to hide. The arrest of Ethan Blake marked a turning point in the investigation, but in homicide cases, the arrest is never the finish line. It is merely the doorway into the next phase, the part where everything collected, observed, analyzed, and reconstructed, must now hold its weight under legal scrutiny. The courtroom is a different battlefield. The rules are sharper, the scrutiny is harsher, and the burden of proof is absolute. For Detective Marissa Cole, the days following Ethan's arrest were not a moment of relief, but the beginning of an exhaustive transition, turning a narrative of evidence into a case capable of surviving every challenge the defense might throw at it. The case file. On a rainy morning, 3 days after Ethan was booked, Cole walked into the Ridgeview County DA's conference room with a box of files, timestamp charts, surveillance stills, and transcripts. Waiting for her was District Attorney David Halloway, the same man who authorized the arrest warrant. Halloway was known for 2 things: precision and patience. The conference room table was long, polished, and already laid out with color-coded folders. Cole placed the evidence box down and began sorting its contents. "Before we go into trial strategy," Halloway said, adjusting his glasses, "I want to walk through every piece one more time. The defense will attack everything: motive, timeline, forensics, child testimony, character, even camera placement. Nothing is safe." Cole nodded. She was ready. Halloway continued, "Our job isn't to assume guilt. It's to prove it clearly, methodically, and without gaps." And so they began. The timeline reconstruction. The two sat in silence as Cole projected the digital timeline onto the wall. Each timestamp represented a moment, a decision, a movement, an inconsistency. 9:04 a.m., Charlotte in kitchen. Normal behavior, no sign of self-harm, no sign of emotional instability. 9:11 a.m., Ethan awake, alert, fully dressed, contradicting his shower story. 9:19 a.m., a tense exchange in the hallway. Charlotte distressed. Ethan agitated. 9:24 a.m., Charlotte comforting Aiden. Longer, tighter than usual, emotional significance noted. 9:29 a.m., both Charlotte and Ethan enter the bedroom. Door closes. 9:31, 9:36 a.m., no footage. Critical window, no witnesses, no audio. 9:36 a.m., scream heard by Aiden. 2 gunshots. 9:37 a.m., Ethan moves through house hiding items, not calling 911. 9:38 a.m., 911 call placed. Story begins. When the timeline finished, Halloway leaned back in his chair. "This is strong," he said, "very strong. But they will argue that we don't have direct evidence of the moment itself." Cole answered calmly, "We don't need footage of the moment. We have everything leading to it and everything after, and none of it matches his story." Her tone wasn't arrogant. It was grounded. Years of experience had taught her that truth doesn't always need a perfect recording. It needs consistency. And Ethan's story lacked it completely. The motive and the pattern. The next challenge was defining a clear motive. Courts don't like ambiguity. A prosecutor must present a reason, or at least a pattern, that explains a defendant's actions. Cole organized surveillance clips on the monitor, each reflecting weeks of tension. Ethan pacing. Ethan confronting. Ethan gesturing aggressively. Charlotte shrinking, withdrawing, flinching. A clear emotional power imbalance. "This wasn't a spontaneous act," Cole explained. "It was an escalation of an existing pattern." Halloway watched the footage quietly. "Control," he said finally. "That's the motive." Control threatened. Control slipping. Control becoming violence. He added, "And the rubber bullet. That shows intent to intimidate first, not kill immediately. That's prosecution gold." Cole nodded. The autopsy evidence supported exactly that. The child testimony. One of the most sensitive parts of the case was the testimony of 6-year-old Aiden Reed. Children were rarely placed on the witness stand, and when they were, the process required extraordinary care. Holloway and Cole agreed that placing Aiden in a courtroom would be traumatizing. However, his forensic interview, conducted by trained specialists in a controlled setting, was admissible. Aiden's two consistent statements stood out. Mommy screamed. Daddy told me she hurt herself. Holloway tapped a pen against the table. The defense will try to dismiss his statement as confusion. They can try, Cole replied, but his phrasing came from an adult, not a child, and screams before a self-inflicted wound are physiologically impossible. Holloway smiled slightly. That's exactly what the jury will hear. The defense strategy anticipated. Every strong prosecution case must simultaneously prepare for the defense playbook. Holloway began outlining likely strategies. 1. Mental health instability of the victim. No evidence supports this. Surveillance shows calm behavior. Family confirms no history of self-harm. 2. Accidental discharge. Autopsy disproves this. GSR absent from victim's hands. Distance and angle inconsistent. 3. Malfunctioning cameras - privacy violation. Cameras were placed by Ethan, not law enforcement. Footage captures daily life, not private acts. No tampering by investigators. 4. Unreliable child witness. Consistent statements. No coaching by investigators. Statements match forensic evidence, not theories. 5. No motive defense. The timeline and surveillance footage clearly establish coercive control. Holloway concluded, they can fight it, but they can't break it. The jury preparation. Any attorney will say it. Juries respond to stories. Not fictional stories, but stories built from evidence, organized logically, and reinforced by human behavior. Holloway worked with Cole to craft a narrative flow. 1. The Blake household was defined by control. 2. The pattern escalated in the days before the homicide. 3. The morning timeline contradicts Ethan's claims. 4. The surveillance footage disproves his movements. 5. The autopsy disproves suicide. 6. The child's testimony aligns with the evidence. 7. The staging of the scene shows consciousness of guilt. By the end of their meeting, the prosecution's narrative was cohesive, compelling, and rooted in facts. But the real test would come in the courtroom. The mock cross-examination. To prepare, Holloway held a mock cross-examination session with Cole acting as a defense attorney. What if they argue the scream came from a different moment? Cole challenged. Holloway answered instantly. The timing matches the gunshots exactly, and Aiden never mentioned hearing a scream at any other time. How about claiming the cameras glitched and misrepresented time? We have metadata, hardware logs, no time drift. The system was stable. And what if they propose another intruder? No forced entry, no prints, no DNA, no open windows, no external presence. The back and forth continued for an hour, eliminating weaknesses, reinforcing strengths. Holloway ended the session with a quiet conclusion. We're ready? The court date set on the evening of the final prep day. Cole left the DA's office and stepped into the Colorado dusk. The sky was streaked with orange, fading into deep blue. The last traces of daylight reflecting on her car window. She stood there for a moment, letting the cool air steady her. She wasn't thinking about the legal strategy, the timeline, or the evidence board. She was thinking about Charlotte, The soft gestures, the long hugs, the quiet fear, the moments that should have added up to a longer life. Cases like this didn't feel like victories, they felt like responsibilities. One final act of protection for someone who never received enough of it while alive. As she opened her car door, her phone buzzed with a notification. Court date confirmed, June 3rd, State of Colorado versus Ethan Blake. Cole took a slow breath. The courtroom battle was about to begin.